Well, greetings. This is Dean Carpenter, Program Scientist of the Albemarle Pamlico National History Partnership, aka APNEP. Welcome to the June presentation of the APNEP Science and Technology webinar series, sponsored by APNEP's Science and Technical Advisory Committee, aka STAC. Today's presenter, Greg Taylor, is the first APNEP STAC member to present in our new webinar series. He is the Senior Soil Scientist for Special Projects who works for the National Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, and is headquartered in Raleigh, North Carolina. He has 25 years of experience as a soil scientist conducting soil surveys of both terrestrial and subaqueous areas. His current position places him in charge of the coastal zone and urban soil surveys within the United States. He has been a APNEP STAC member since 2017. Just a little aside here, my first introduction to Greg was in January of 2017 when I was giving an invited talk on ecosystem-based management to an advisory committee of a national estuary program in Barnegat Bay, New Jersey. And during the Q&A, Greg shared a very brief overview of the NRCS subaqueous soil survey work in the Barnegat Bay area. And he then shared, to my surprise, that he was based in Raleigh. And it said, we got to talk. Well, it didn't take much more talk to convince me of the survey's merit. And once I learned that Albemarle Pamlico Estuarine System was on NRCS's survey priority list, I began cheering and nudging Greg and his team to commence the survey. You will soon learn about very soon. So note that this presentation is being recorded for later access via APNEP's YouTube video channel. Now I will hand the virtual mic to Greg so he may begin his presentation. Thank you. Greg?
Thank you, Dean, very much. and it's funny, yeah, we had just finished Barnegat Bay and we were trying to I guess, sell it, if you will, as it was one of our larger coastal zone projects at the time, and so we were really proud of it. And so yeah, with that, I'm going to hit some buttons and see what happens. As I was telling when we first started this, WebEx is not my home virtual platform. It's Teams usually, so I'm going to, let's see, hopefully this one, share. Everybody give me just a second to get everything fixed here. Can everybody see me?
Yep.
All righty. I'm going to try to move some things around so that just bear with me. Here we go. All right. So again, as Dean said, I'm going to introduce you guys. Many of you on this call or on this webinar have seen a lot of this before. Everywhere we go, though, it seems like people get bits and pieces of what we do or why we do it. And so I want to take the opportunity to give a more holistic approach as to coastal zone soil survey, the special projects office or region, just a little bit more in depth because I have more time than normal. So forgive me if a lot of you have seen some of this before, but I promise some of it, some of you have, or most of you have never seen. So again, let's see. Advance for me. There we go. All right. My name is Greg Taylor. I'm a senior soil scientist for special projects. I am originally a soil scientist out of Georgia. That's where the accent you hear comes from. And spent most of my career out of there. I've worked in Texas. Got interested in the coast. We have different structures here with the federal government. So working with NRCS, I was a soil scientist for a major land project office, MLRA Soil Survey Project Office in Richmond Hill, Georgia, which is just outside of Savannah. So when I got there, people began to ask us about a lot of the mapping in the marsh was the catchphrase we were using at the time, because so much of it was just mapped as marsh, tidal marsh, high saltwater marsh, whatever. It was a miscellaneous area, and I'll get into that soon. But if you're looking at the screen here, I'm the fat guy on the left in the black T-shirt. That's me. This is my staff. A lot of folks that work with me, and just various pictures. So what is a special projects region? Well, first of all, the NRCS a few years ago realized that we were getting requests to do things we wouldn't typically thought of as doing or wasn't completely prepared for. So for years we had starting in probably 2014, we had teams that would respond to certain things, and coastal zone soil survey was one of those specialties. So two of our major outliers at the time became more and more popular. So they decided, hey, we need to have folks dedicated to this. And so the special projects region was started, and we control urban and coastal zone across the United States. Urban soil survey is another aspect or topic that I work with daily. So how do we get involved? The bottom line is if it requires specialized equipment, expertise, training, logistics, processes, it tends to fall under us. We deviate in that we use different tactics or approaches, but at the end of the day, the information still goes to the same place. All soil survey information goes, and that's the NRCS, our National Soils Information System, and our EDIT system, Ecological Dynamics Interpretive Tool. And that's all public-facing web soil survey, no special access or permissions to get to our data. It's annually updated, end of September every year. Projects based off request, customer input, whatever. We don't go somewhere without being invited or without good calls, whether we're mapping ag land or coastal land. Then it goes through a rigorous quality assurance, quality control process. And then it's updated every year. End of September, the web soil survey is refreshed. All the new data hits it. And I'll get into some of the data that's going to be hitting this year. Some of you may be interested in. But when we got into like coastal zone, because of boats and the specialized equipment, we go through some of that real quick. It was a burden for certain offices to have a boat and keep it up, and then that boat only be used once every 3 years or something. So we thought the best thing to do is keep this equipment moving, keep it in production, keep it being used, but then also house in one place all the people that can do everything from teach others how to run it to maintain it, how to fix it. And so that's how the special projects came about, and that's why we were located here in Raleigh, because we already had a lot of the infrastructure in place. Here's what it looks like. We are called a region, but that's simply because that's honestly staffing charts on a flow chart under a government staffing chart. So, but you can see this is my staff. Rob Tunstead, many of you may know. If you don't, he's a senior soil scientist for Coastal Zone Soil Survey. He is under me, and he spends his time being the expert on coastal zone, where you have someone like Randy Riddle, who is our expert on urban. And then you can see others under there. We do have a few vacancies that we hope to fill soon. So what do we do? I mentioned this earlier. It stemmed from things like this. If you can see on this screen, there is a water body. This is actually up in Rhode Island. And if you was to look at the little yellow writing that you may or may not can see very clearly on there, it was all miscellaneous areas. It was stuff like freshwater marsh, saltwater marsh, tidal marsh high. It was just a miscellaneous area. When you clicked on the information in our database, nothing was there. So what we do is we come into these areas and we fill in the blanks. We try to update the coastal mapping, the marshes, put usable data in there, especially things like blue carbon and whatnot. And then out into the water, we make sure that we collect soils information for make it useful. Subaquatic vegetation, dredge material, blue carbon again, aquaculture concerns like oyster habitat. I'll get into those in just a second. But that's the process. You got to understand that we do it. Soil survey started, in fact, we're celebrating the 125th year of soil survey. It started 1899, and it's the same process that it started out on. You take landforms. If you're USDA being our home agency, we were focused on ag land forever. And when we got to coastal areas, we would just go by them. Same thing with urban, was we would just call them a tidal marsh or whatever else, because our focus was corn and not something underwater at the time, or our focus was agriculture. But still, you map soils the same way. You take a landform, imagine, if you will, a hilltop, a hill sticking up in the middle of a flat field, and you would have a landform position on it. You got a hilltop, a shoulder, maybe a side slope, toe slope, foot slopes. You've got different ways to break down that landform that allows you to to delineate a line between the two, and the soil properties follow that landform. You do the same thing underwater, except we just use bathymetry. So it's a little bit different way of thinking, but in the end, it's the same thing. And this is sort of what it looks like. If this is a block diagram that shows where these soils live, and you can see these are delineated out by map units. And I'll get into how you can use that information and all, but I just wanted to give you that's a visual of what we do. Now, tools and equipment that we use over time, we've specialized. We started out with little things like this. This was a John boat that just had a moon pool in it. That this is one of our first pieces of equipment that we used to get up in certain marshes and pull samples. Then we have progressed to this is one of our airboats that we're very proud of. These things are extremely useful in shallow water and on marshes, as you can imagine. Then we have specialized pontoon boats that we built. These are Clark boats. They're a shallow draft boat. This picture is actually taken down in Florida when we're about to start on parts of the Indian River Lagoon. And then we have other boats that support us, whether it's through training, bringing people to and from sites, equipment, allowing us to recon larger areas. Then we have bay boats like this. And then this is our newest addition. This is a 26-foot pontoon boat made for where we have rougher seas and everything. This came from a need. We were asked to map Long Island Sound. I'll get into some of these projects soon too. But the waves were bigger. It was just we needed something that could handle it. We needed a bigger boat. So that is that. Just to give you a comparison in this side shot here, you can see when we talked earlier about Barnegat Bay, the little boat you see to the right was all we had to map Barnegat Bay. And you can see how much bigger these boats are by looking at the one on the left, the big 26-foot Aquaka boat. So again, we have a lot of specialized equipment, a lot of specialized processes. We have a lot of pipe we go through. That's how we pull these. So we have trailers. We have like 3 or 4 different of these trailers that's been customized to haul our pipe. On the right, you'll see the refrigerated trailers that we use. Our cores are stored and transported in those. It allows us to chill them when we pull them out of the water. End of the day, we bring them in, put them in these mobile units, and get them down to almost freezing. So we retard a lot of that chemistry, and so we're able to go back at a later date and split them. Usually end of the week or something. They don't stay in there long, but allows us a simple place to store things, transport it, and keep it cool. Some other technology that we have: side scan sonar, and we have different types of waves. We vibrate into the pipe you see there. It looks like we're raising a flag at Iwo Jima, but that's actually Alligator River in Albemarle, Pamlico. So we're able to advance this pipe through some of these stumps and everything by using. If you look over here, this is a big to the right. There is a guy running the gas vibra core. And then the little orange thing you see on the bottom left here, that's an electric vibra core. Much of our equipment came from something else. You can't go to the store and say, hey, I want a soil vibra core. They don't exist. So we take things that's made for example, the gas one there is originated for concrete. The one on the left was actually vibrators that they bolt to grain elevators to keep seeds and all from clumping through the process of running up the elevator. And we talked to the companies, and they sort of retrofitted some of their equipment so we could bolt it to a pipe and then vibrate it into the bottom. So what's it used for? Look, if what you're trying to manage, restore, inventory, or protect has a dependency on a bottom type, then that's where Coastal Zone comes in. Because to us, the bottom type it's just a soil property. Soil physical and chemical properties, we use that to relate to the needs of its habitat, whatever. We create interpretations. Basically, what an interpretation is, a fancy way of saying we're trying to give the end user the least amount of clicks with a mouse needed to get the information they need. So, but we add all that in, whether it's what we can see in the soils or other outside information, fetch, temperature, certain things that's not specifically tied to the soil. We add that in or allow you to build a database off that so that you can start seeing where A plus B will equal C. For example, oyster production and restoration. A lot of that depends on a bottom top. We have an interpretation that allows you to make a thematic map like you see here. You can go into the area of interest and say, hey, I want to know how this is, where do I spend my money and my time trying to restore oysters? And where should we put money, USDA money, a lot of times towards aquaculture. So as you can see, it makes a map. The red is bad, the green is good, and so on and so forth. But it's basically also baseline information to track changes in sea level rise. Again, that we've been at this for well over 100 years. So there's a lot of maps out there, and you can take our most current map and you can actually use like Google Earth, like this is overlaid here, and you can start seeing how much shoreline we've lost. This is actually out near Stumpy Point, again in Albemarle, Pamlico, and I'm going to get into a study area. This is part of a study area, and I'll get into that about tracking blue carbon. But it allows you, just like how we can go out and tell a farmer, hey, plant your corn here based off the soil survey. We can do the same thing in a subaqueous environment. And we can also, just like how we can tell the farmer, hey, this is where your good soil is, so you want to do things to save it. If you're a refuge manager, for example, we can come along and say, hey, look how much carbon you've got inside your refuge. So you definitely want to do things to keep this carbon there. So again, subaquatic vegetation, that's not a big stretch. If we can tell you where best to grow corn or the best way to get Bermuda grass to grow in your front yard, it's not a stretch for us to tell you the best soil conditions for subaquatic vegetation. Again, it depends on the bottom type, right? Dredge and mooring anchors, something that goes into the bottom. We can tell you if it's soft or hard, what kind of mooring anchors you need to look for, but also things like acid sulfate potential. If you see this picture here on the bottom left, and you look at this dredge opening up, this is that black monosulfidic ooze that we call it, that when it's exposed to the atmosphere, oxidizes, and the end of that equation is sulfuric acid. So you need to know that, because if you're going to do a thin layer deposition with dredge material, you can very, very easily kill what you're trying to save instead of slowly raising that marsh up to combat sea level rise. You end up doing like they did here, and you kill half the marsh because the material you put over it doesn't like being exposed to the atmosphere. It oxidizes. Anaerobic conditions become aerobic conditions, and you drop the pH to, and we've seen pHs in these areas like 1.9, just hovering around 2, which is extremely low. So blue carbon saltwater intrusion, that's the biggest things that we're working on lately. We're looking at what happens to the soil, what soils help or don't help when we start seeing these ghost forests forming. This is an Albemarle sound. This was actually out near Alligator River, and you can see some of the cores that we pulled from the area, and we can start talking about carbon and all in there. And that's the biggest things that we get right now. But data collected, how it supports interpretations. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I'm not asking you guys to be dirt nerds with me, but there's a reason we pull certain things. There's a reason we analyze the soil for certain particles. And just to give you an idea, like with oysters and all, we want to know the sulfide content, soil pH, the salinity, the texture, how much sand, silt, and clay is there. And just as a note, you can see here, we're working these a lot of our interps we started in the Northeast, Rhode Island, Connecticut areas, and it worked our way south. And as we move south, we're continually checking our numbers and checking our input to make sure that we're getting the same results. That if we say an area is good, we have a history there of it being suitable for oysters, for example. And so we're just as we learn more, we adjust these interpretations. So dredge material, I mentioned that we set aside the samples and let them oxidize over 16 weeks to mimic what would happen if you did a thin layer deposition. Eelgrass habitat, again, water depth, soil texture, things like rock, things that's going to block the growth of the plants. Blue carbon by horizon, 200 centimeters. I'll get into that. That's something that we're getting better and better at, and we have an interp that we're creating for that, and I'll get into that real quick. Of course, I mentioned dead weight or mushroom anchors. Knowing that what type of bottom you've got will help you determine how best to anchor something in it. So, and here's some interpretations that we're currently working on. Living shoreline. When you start thinking about coming in and tearing out these hardened structures, these hardened seawalls, What's the loading rate of that? Well, we've seen it be successful and not be successful because the check dams or whatever we put out in front of it, sometimes they actually sink into the soil, and it negates that protection you're trying to establish so that you can get a natural shoreline, living shoreline established. Marsh vulnerability, this is something that we've almost completed. Basically, it allows you to know the erosion potential, the loss potential for a certain marsh migration corridors. That goes hand in hand with it. Over time, where can we expect these marshes to migrate? Oyster clam suitability, mentioned that. Soil salinization potential, saltwater intrusion. I'll touch on that a little bit more soon. Blue carbon quantification, we'll definitely get into that. And we're always looking for what else. Folks like you guys on this webinar, we're always open to your input. What do we not cover? What do we not have? Is a soil survey the best route to answer some of those questions? Sometimes it's not. A lot of times we feel like it is. So I want to talk specifically about blue carbon inventory and mapping, and I want to dive into that because this is the biggest topic that we have. This is my way of saying it. This is what's making our phone ring lately. So we started looking at different places. You can see Swan Quarter here, Alligator River, and so forth. We took several areas around Albemarle Pamlico Sound and ran a transect, if you will. Now I want to try to explain this slide. So everybody look on the left here, and you'll see this little diagram that's drawn. And what that represents is a soil profile. You see these little O horizons? All that means is organics. It's deep organics. That is what the marsh looks like when you go and stand up on the marsh. And I'm going to click right here, and I just want to show you what I'm talking about. As you get up in here in this marsh area before it's water, you can see this is what you typically would see. A lot of organic soils. Looks like layers of a cake, right? As water comes into this, as you take this shallow water habitat and make it deeper water through sea level rise, you're introduced, you stop a lot of the flushing of fresh and salt, and it becomes more saline, makes it saltier. Just like these layers are stacked like a cake, they're formed that way. They begin to die off or lop off or erode off just like that. They tend to do it pretty quickly. And so what we did is, I'm going to click again. What we did is we came out here in the water where this was once a marsh. We said, okay, we know what we have here. So let's see what happens as we move out to the water's edge from, again, for this map was compiled in the 70s, early 80s. So we know that in the 80s, that was the water line. You see the W map unit, that just means water. The HOA is Habani. This is Pungo, the PUA. That's just a soil type, a soil name, soil series. But okay, so we started with something known and went into the unknown, right? And so we started seeing this. So if you'll compare it, we just went just a few meters off the shore, and we noticed, you see this picture here, and then this representative profile here to the right of it. And you see this O layer over an A. Well, if you hop over here, that is where we're at now by just moving a few meters into the water. So in other words, from this 20ASE1, don't worry about that. That won't be on the test. But from there up, that's what we've lost over X amount of time due to sea level rise. We know how much carbon is in these layers of the cake or soil horizons. So I can tell you by sea level, based off sea level rise, how much carbon we've lost in this area. As we move further out right onto the edge of the water line, you'll notice there is no organics left. So we begin to make a progressive map or an interpretation over saying, as sea level rises, these soils, these organic soils that were built up in this marsh environment, we're losing these horizons at this rate. Therefore, we're losing this much carbon. And again, this sort of shows you that line. So carbon, why is it important? I'm not going to get into the weeds because I'm probably preaching to the choir with this group, but we've kept up, and I say we, the soil survey program for over 100 years have kept up with soil organic carbon. That's in all of our data. But again, it was started out basically focused on agriculture because it indicates a soil quality. You want a good carbon amount because it promotes plant growth. So because it holds moisture and things like that. But another good aspect or quality of organic carbon is it mitigates climate change. It takes that carbon out of the atmosphere and holds it. The plant roots pull it down, or it's incorporated in through the seawater or the bays and sounds. So how do you figure that out? Again, this won't be on the test, but there is an equation for that. Just like there's an app for that, yeah, there's a mathematical equation on how you come up with soil organic carbon. This is it. So if we take that, and let's take, this is a soil that Machapunga, I'm sorry, I murdered that name. It means Matamesquite. This is a soil that we established at Matamesquite at the National Wildlife Refuge. And you can see how we are easily able to break this down. If you want to know your carbon stocks down to 2 meters, there it is, by kilograms per meter squared. If you want to know for 100 centimeters, there's the math. There it is, 50 centimeters. So in other words, this is something that's been in our data for years, but a lot of the data wasn't focused for coastal zone. A lot of the data was guesstimated because we wasn't really literally getting our feet wet, jumping into these marshes and these shallow water environments and pulling soil samples. We're doing that now. So we're going back and fixing a lot of that information, and we're making this available to the public. So it's easy for you to quickly determine how much carbon is in an area when we start talking about blue carbon. So again, okay, that is think of that as site specific. That's a hole in the ground. That's a hole in a marsh, a hole in a subaqueous environment, whatever. That's telling you the data that's coming out of there. But we map soils. So we have to figure out a way to project that. And again, our standards allow us to project soil properties over larger areas. So let's move into something like a map unit scale. And what a map unit scale is, if you see again, back to this slide, the HOA and the PUA, how much carbon is actually in that map unit? Because if I'm a scientist trying to make predictions or trying to convey to other people, hey, this is really important. Well, a hole here doesn't say a lot. So what about if we wanted to spread out and say something about how much carbon is lost further up and down this area? How about even larger scale? Better yet, how about for the entire county? So what we've done is this is the output from that interpretation. And so I was able to run this the other day. This is for Dare County. And so you can see when you have a Habani soil, that Habani map unit, it has out here broke down as how much carbon, whether you want to go by 50 centimeters, 50 to 100, 100 to 150, 200 centimeters, any of those ranges, we break it down. Now, this is not very clear because Habani is a deep organic soil. We got the same numbers on every horizon. But as you get to the Pungo here, you can notice that as you get deeper, you're starting to lose some of those organics, and you're starting to lose some of the carbon amounts. But you can compare it to any of the others in here that's within that county, and it's a way for you to quickly understand how much carbon we're dealing with. So you take this, plug it into your spatial analysis, and you say, wow, the soil survey shows that when this was published in the 80s, that we had this much Habani soil, or these map units along the coast. We've lost this percentage of them spatially. We can deduce from that how much carbon we've lost. And it's scientific. It's actually not a guesstimate. It's based off data we're collecting, data that's updated every year. So what about carbon for an entire series? So how much carbon does a soil like Habani hold? What can we expect? So what we're doing too is we're coming in. This is a Quimbog series set up in Connecticut for Long Island Sound, but we're going in there. And if you look, this is a typical official series description, or OSD, we call it. Again, this won't be on the test. Stay with me. Don't fall asleep yet. But if you look, we have all this information stored in here that's available to the public, but it's got a range of characteristics. And if you zoom in on that, it actually has total soil organic carbon stock to 200 centimeters, and it breaks it down in a range. So if you're dealing with a Quimbog series, for example, you can know that you're dealing with this much carbon. You can start looking at it and saying, wow, again, the Habani series, this is a big carbon pool, a very important blue carbon soil. So you start looking at that more on a larger scale, and it allows you to project certain estimates. So let's apply this to the real world. We're taking what we know about how these layers of the cake break off. Remember that story, and remember those pictures I showed you earlier. of how, as we progress from the marsh out into the water, what was once mapped this soil is now underwater. So we are able to say, as this water has progressed over it, this is what will happen to this soil, to this carbon. So taking what we've learned, let's project it into North Carolina, and let's take into account NOAA's estimated sea level rise over the next 80 years. So by doing so, you'll see that sea level rise right now is 0 feet. We have about 1,126 square miles of coastal area, when that accounts for about 47 million tons per square mile of carbon, blue carbon in the area. So let's start putting a sea level rise to it, and this is what we start seeing. With 1 foot of sea level rise, you're looking at losing about 6% of the area around the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound. But then you're also talking about losing 15% of the carbon. You're going to see this as we continue. 2 feet, you lose 14% of your area, 32% of your carbon. So in other words, carbon, you're losing twice the amount of carbon as you are surface area. Again, 3.5, 19 to 43. 7 feet is pretty sad. You're losing 27% of your surface area, but you're losing over half of your carbon that's being sequestered, stored, protected within Albemarle-Pamlico Sound. So this allows you to put numbers based off scientific data, based off real world data, actually literally pulled from the sound. So, but why? Why follow this? There's a lot of other folks out there who are in the blue carbon game, I guess you could say. And this is why. This is why I always sell the National Cooperative Soil Survey standards, and this our approach is when we have standards. If so many people are, this is how we got into this, is we were actually helping other people with our expertise and being able to pull these cores. We're going out and helping other people sample for blue carbon. One group would have us go to 30 centimeters and they'd sample every 5 centimeters, or they may homogenize the top 10 or whatever. And then we'd have someone else go to 50 centimeters and we may go every 5 centimeters, every 10 centimeters, or maybe we go to 100 centimeters and we would sample every 3, every 5, every 10. We may homogenize the horizons. Well, during this whole process, so many of us kept saying, wait a minute, we covered this. We have a standard for sampling soils, for mapping soils, for conveying soils. It's just that when you start thinking about blue carbon, so many people don't realize that's just a property within a soil. That's a soil property. It's a property we've been tracking for ages because it's so important to agriculture. The other thing that we have that I feel like is important is what I've been talking about, is our database. We have the world's largest environmentally focused database. NASIS, our National Soils Information System, our database that feeds Web Soil Survey, has data for all of the soils in the entire United States. So again, it's the world's largest environmentally focused database. It's huge. No one else has the capacity or ability to hold that much information. And third, we have the mandate. We are congressionally mandated by Congress to study and document the soil resources of the United States. What that means, though, is if you go out, if you don't work with us, if you don't work for the NRCS, for example, and you're out on someone's marsh and you're finding that it has this much carbon in it, or it has these soil properties, if you go and post that on the internet for everybody to see, you literally open yourself up to liability, because you're sharing information that you're not mandated to share. We are. We have the permissions, we have the conduit, and we have the congressional backing to tell people about the soils on public and private land. So, leaving carbon, let's go into saltwater intrusion and retention. And why is that important? So what we started looking at too is not only as what is happening to these soils as we see this progression of as these forests are beginning to die off, and you're starting to see a marsh try to form, as you're starting to see Phragmites, Spartina, everything else coming in, as you see this progression, how much carbon is being lost, but also what does that mean for things like ag land? So what we started realizing, if you see this ditch right here in the forefront of this field, so much of North Carolina, so much Albemarle-Pamlico Sound around the coastline was drained for agriculture. This has been going on for for a long, long time, well before wetland protections were in place. But these ditches now, due to sea level rise, are doing the opposite. What was once designed to take water away from a field and make it productive for agriculture is now ushering in salt water from the sound into these fields. Now you got to understand, on a marsh, these organic soils that I showed you earlier, they flush. They don't have a lot of clay or fine material in there to hold things like salt, nitrogen, anything else that may come and go. And so they flush. You get rains, you get tides, you get wind, you get different things, and these soils tend to flush the water out of them. But when you get into an ag field, these fields have clay and other particles in them that grab nutrients. So what makes them productive for agriculture? You can add nitrogen to this field, and there's a good chance the roots of those plants will be able to access it and use it. But that also means that as salt comes in, it's held and it's not released. So we're starting to see in these fields salinity that is twice that of the adjacent marsh. Because again, these soils didn't form under marsh conditions; they formed under upland conditions. So if you follow me, what USDA is looking at is how do we mitigate that? Is there a way for us to come in and tell the farmer when they're starting to see this, rather than throwing good money after bad and trying to plant something that has no chance of survival? It's just too salty. It's not going to happen. What if we started doing things like engineering practices, planting practices that would save the carbon in these soils, give the farmer a little money to offset his loss, where they come in and can promote marsh growth here. It also will start a buffer between them and their ag land. So it's actually, we're trying to look at a win-win between farmers and sea level rise, if at all possible. But again, trying to negate that wasted money. So some of the partners and all that we work with, we get this a lot. It's pretty much anybody that calls. This is a long list of folks. Many of you are on this call, but we find ourselves working with a lot of people. If you look on there, one of our smallest partners is ourselves. We don't work with NRCS as much as we work with outside of the NRCS. So how do we get involved? You get a hold of us. At the end of this, you'll see my email. You call us. We take requests. We like letters of request. We come in once we get requests in an area. We build teams. We come in and train you on what you need to know. You'll see here on the top right that we train people on everything from safety, survival on boats to how to maintain an engine and things like that. And then we take that data and we apply it to our database, but we provide quality assurance, quality control over that. And so we make sure all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted before it goes out to the public. So you don't have to be the soils expert. You just have to let us know you need us, and we come in, we do the rest. One thing that, and I'll get into that later. So why do we run it across the United States? This is a lot of information basically to tell you that, hey, we want people to be safe. We train people on how to run boats. We don't want that. We don't want someone in California being taught something different than they are in Connecticut. So we run the whole United States through this office, but it's also about data. We want the data that can be consistent. We want our interpretations to run. So many of the problems that we have that's inherent to our large database is it becomes localized, and certain states run things a certain way, certain regions. We wanted to do away with that. So when they gave us the authority to run these projects out of the United States, we ran the data the same way. So as we learn something new in Connecticut, we will apply it to California, for example. So finding projects, how does projects come to us? I told you that, emails, you let us know. But a lot of times we look for it. We see bulletins, newsletters, we're reading, we're looking. We're always looking for that next big project, the next big thing. Word of mouth, that's where so many of our projects come from. And so the following slides highlight how some of these projects came about. One of our biggest projects is Salton Sea. I had a call about this yesterday. And this really started as the Salton Sea. If some of you are not familiar, you can Google it. Really cool place. As the water's receding off of this area, what kind of soil and therefore dust conditions can they expect? Word got around that, hey, we know a group of guys that can map soils while the water is still over it, so that we can have certain management practices in place, ready to go as soon as the water goes off, because we know what kind of soil conditions we have coming, we can expect. Long Island Sound, part of a billion oyster initiative that started in the Northeast. A lot of other folks talking to each other. Word got around, and ultimately a senator heard about us. And he came to us and said, "Hey, what would it cost for you guys to map Long Island Sound?" We give them a price, and you'll see that we finished Connecticut end of that this year, and it's going to be published to Web Soil Survey this coming year. The Connecticut end, we moved to the New York side next year. We have a crew up there in Tolland, Connecticut, and so again, word of mouth. But then we had a senator actually give us money. Indian River Lagoon, Florida, another one of our larger projects. Rob Tunstead and I were talking at a Soil Science Society of America meeting as we walked down off the stage. Dr. Rex Ellis, Dr. Todd Osborne. Rex is with the St. John's Water Management District. Todd Osborne's University of Florida. They called us at the end of the stage and started asking us questions. And they wanted a foundation after all the algal blooms had decimated the area. They wanted to know a restoration plan. They thought soils would be a good base for that. At Island, Mississippi, I was talking at a Ray conference. After the Ray conference, people come up and got my business card. Apalachicola Bay, Florida, very similar. We're working with Penn State on a project. Word got around. They sent us this letter here. Now you'll see this in the black here. This is a letter from a letter requesting us to come map Apalachicola Bay, Florida. We really like those. The reason being is if I end up on 60 Minutes, I've got a reason that we're here, because otherwise I would be mapping the Florida Keys all the time. But we don't map the Florida Keys because no one's asked us, and we don't have letters requesting us to be down there. So we have to be careful when we show up with all the stuff I showed you in the previous slides. We tend to gain attention, especially the airboat, the big pontoon boats. So we got to have a reason. We got to have something in our back pocket that says, yeah, we're here not on our own, but because someone has asked us. And that's where those letters of request come in. I'm almost done. These are the projects that's being published this year. Long Island Sound Phase 1, the Connecticut side. Cape Fear River, North Carolina. That was a project that we did with University of UNCW, University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Banana River, Florida, which is just a portion of the Indian River I mentioned earlier. Mobile, Tennessee River, Alabama. West Galveston Bay, Texas. Finished that up, moving to Matagorda Bay now. And Lake Mattamuskeet, North Carolina. Again, projects that we're starting is Apalachicola Bay, Currituck Sound. That's a big one. A lot of you have been on the emails concerning that. We're getting that up and rolling. Hobos Bay, Puerto Rico. That one's ongoing, almost done. Continuing Salton Sea, Matagorda Bay, and doing CRIMS work in Louisiana. So with that, I think I've taken my 45 minutes exactly, it looks like, and I'll open it up to any questions.
Okay.
Wilson, I see your hand up.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Greg. Great presentation, as always. I have two questions. One of them is, and I noticed you had Mattamuskeet on your list of projects that were done there. Did you all map the soils in those waterfowl sub-impoundments around the periphery of Mattamuskeet as well as the lake itself?
Yes, some of it. Now, did we get into the weeds on updating? I'm not going to say that we did, but on around Mattamuskeet, one thing that we actually even did is we took a PXRF or portable XRF out, and we wanted to look at lead content from previous, duck hunting in the area back when lead was allowed. So we actually even try to add that to some of our data. So just to let you know some of how deep into the weeds we got on some of that. But yes, we have updated everything around it as well.
Okay, hey, that's great. So yeah, I would be interested in talking to you offline too, especially about the lead stuff. And then the only other question I had was, you mentioned looking at habitat suitability for oysters and hard clams. by any chance, as you all have been mapping these coastal subaqueous soils, have you tried to characterize the benthic macrofaunal communities that are associated with each soil type as well?
That is what we're hoping to do for Currituck Sound. We have been we didn't mean to, but inadvertently we became two silos. And so we had the soils folks running out, pulling cores, but we realized for these interpretations to run correctly, it would be better if we had an interp on the soil side, but we have the state and transition model on the ecological side. And so how could we marry all of those to get, again, we're trying to make it as simple as possible. We don't want everybody to be, you don't have to be a soils expert to understand our data, or we're trying to make it that way. So Currituck Sound is one of the first ones where we're going to look at our SAV populations and type, and then we're going to get soil types that go along with those. Same thing with carbon, and also how much carbon is being stored under these. That's just one example. Same thing with oysters, clams, and all that, and how they all interact. And that's what we're learning, and so that's where we're headed to. And Currituck Sound is our next big experiment, I should say.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I would be again interested. I know Mattamuskeet at one time had a fairly large and viable Rangia clam population in it. I don't know whether you all found them still there or not. It's you're well aware of all, and everybody else is too, of all the changes that have taken place in Mattamuskeet. So yeah, again, I'd be interested in talking further to you offline about this at some point. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Mattamuskeet was amazing because a lot of you may or may not know, we've got turn of the century, we got a soil map of the place, early 1900s. And so we had something to sort of go by that told us, hey, this is what was there when they farmed the place. And so anyway, we were able to, we use actually some of that in how we map. There's another hand up.
Hans, is that?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
Hans,
me.
okay.
Yeah. Hey, great talk. Well, it's interesting. All the places that you listed, they're all being impacted by an increase in tropical storm and hurricane activity, except maybe one or two. And we've been very concerned about the impacts that that's having on carbon loss, particularly venting of CO2 back up into the atmosphere. But of course, that involves, erosional things and stuff that's going on with the soils themselves. But it's also complicated by the increased loading of organic matter from the watershed. And I was just curious, how might you integrate that with impacts of sea level rise, for example? Um, uh, Joey Croswell, who was a PhD student of mine, wrote a paper in Limnology and Oceanography, back in 2014, where he showed that one single hurricane that went over, I forget which one it was, and we've had so many, it was in 2011, I think, led to as much carbon loss from the Albemarle, from the Neuse River estuary, as was fixed by plants in the estuary during that year. So the storms themselves have huge impacts on carbon losses, as well as venting of carbon back up into the atmosphere. And I'm just curious whether you all have, thought about that and can incorporate that along with sea level rise impacts, because I think the increased storm activity is probably a big player in all this.
You nailed a lot of things. The fate of carbon as when it's released and when it's dislodged from the soil is something that everybody has some good ideas, but actually, would you hear me talk about actually on the cap that I wear? We're part of what's called the National Cooperative Soil Survey. We typically work with universities when we have these type of questions. This is where the USDA funds people to get their masters and PhDs, to be very honest. And these are the type of questions that we are after right now. Carbon, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, those type of things. Those are big on our radar. Can we take our soils information and that be part of the analysis? A lot of times we do it spatially, but or can that be part? And we're finding out, yeah, but we're also, we have, I'm trying to think of where this, it was in the Scuppernong right there at the Mount Bull Bay, or I think is what it's called right there. A lot in my mind right now. We actually looked at Fetch because it was acting as a slower version of a hurricane, for example. And we did some studies in there. But to answer your question, we are looking at it, but we're still trying to get our collective head around a lot of the fate of it and exactly how to project that, because when you work for the federal government, people will major on a minor. So in other words, if we come in with certain data, they tend to overestimate, underestimate, or over exaggerate what we're actually saying. So a lot of times it's better if we're going to move at a steady pace of this, or what I mean by a steady pace and not a steady pace is we typically work with universities on that. Yes, we have a lot of different studies going. We actually, some of you are on this call. We've got a lot of the base information working with VIMS, NC State, University of Rhode Island, and we're taking that data and we're trying to see different ways of how to track this, especially with storm surge. That's something that has been asked of us from Florida, North Carolina, a lot of the states that this weighs, Texas, weighs heavily on.
Yeah, it sounds like the time scale, there's a big time scale difference there between sea level rise issues and acute events like storms, for example. Yeah, that's a big question in terms of carbon loss and moving carbon back up in the atmosphere. And of course, some people have hypothesized that hurricanes kind of breed themselves, because if this is happening and with increased frequency and more carbon ends up in the atmosphere, it's just going to make the storm stronger too, because of warming. So it's kind of an evil cycle there.
You're exactly correct. Man of Mesquite, the SAV died there because it got muddy. The water got turbid. The more turbid it got, the more grass died. The more grass died, the more. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. That's something that we've discussed is they become, they breed more hurricanes breed more hurricanes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Looks like Nathan and Paul have their hands up.
I'm sorry, you may have said this and I may have missed it. I got distracted by a phone call I had to take. So do y'all measure like mineral nutrients, nitrate, ammonia, phosphate, that kind of thing?
Yes, it's part of our typical analysis. When we can, we run like just I want to say a simplified nitrogen, phosphorus, anything like that, because again, our base of information, if we send it to our lab, is that's a given. They're always going to run those. That's just part of our suite of analysis that we run. Now, one thing we're realizing in the coastal environment, especially subaqueous, is because the way you have to dry a sample, we're pulling a sample that's very wet, and we got to run all these analysis on it's dry. We're losing a lot of that. So it's the bad part of being on an industrial scale. So we're starting to actually run our samples differently, run them locally. Right now, we're working with NC State as one of our biggest local partners because they have a soils lab. Any university that has a soils where you can go get a degree in soils, they tend to be the folks we lean towards to help us with analysis without having to ship it to Lincoln, Nebraska, for example. So we know where the holes are and we're trying to fill them. Let me just say that.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Greg. It's Paul. Yeah, great presentation. Really interesting. Question, have you given presentations like this to the ag community in North Carolina or other states? And if so, what has been their reaction? What I'm thinking is there an opportunity to partner with them, to work more closely together to figure out how to make a smoother transition in places where the agriculture that has been practiced is no longer you can eyeball it not being viable anymore because of the saltwater intrusion, and therefore these other income sources pursuing more actively the blue carbon and other kinds of revenue streams.
Yes, and just as an example, one of the computer issues I was having before we had this webinar is I had a different program pulled up and it was having a hard time. What I'm doing is I'm talking to the national director of our WRP Wetland Reserve Program, and we're looking at doing putting these coastal areas or these salt affected fields under something like that. And so we are looking at a way to make it to tie it to programs so that when conservation end wants to help here, they have a program code they can put into CDN cart, and without getting into the weeds of how the NRCS runs. But yes, we are. Understand too, though, that states are slow. This is the saying about the big ship. NRCS is huge. And we do things in some states for like oysters and clams, for example, EQIP money. If anybody's familiar with some of our programs, EQIP, a lot of money goes to oysters and clams in the states in the Northeast. The South, they haven't adopted that yet. The South hasn't adopted a lot of our recommendations as to saltwater intrusion and all, but it's happening. So we just, you know, Paul, I catch myself a lot of times. I just keep preaching to the choir. We do talk a lot within our own agency and all, but um, it's hard to change things because people just want to go home at the end of the day and hey, it's been working. There's no need to change this. So, but as we all know, especially folks probably on this call and in the world that I deal in outside of agriculture, we're trying to tell people you need to get things ready. You need to get plans in place. And so I'm going to keep beating that drum as long as someone will listen. But yeah, we do talk within the ag community. Them listening may be a different story.
Then drilling down to that a little bit more, you mentioned a category called salt-affected fields. I mean, that's just science. It's salt affected or it's not. You don't have to it's not a question of belief, or you can observe it or you can test it, something like that. So there's one question: is it a salt-affected field, which is a science technical question. The other is, do I want to do something about it that's different from just let it do what it naturally would do? So is the category of salt affected field, is that like getting specified on the maps or in other sort of ways so that you don't have to do anything about it, but that's the fact, like a floodplain map, something like that, just facts on the ground?
Our soil surveys, as we're updating, we have, our soil surveys, you classify soil just like you do a tree. And it's got a similar classification system, a lot of Latin, a lot of big confusing words, but we are adapting that into our classification system so that when we update some of these fields, the taxonomy, the soil mapping, everything changes with it. And so, yeah, that is coming, and we're working on that as we speak.
If you don't mind me drilling just a little bit more, I know we're short of time. Is have there been maps or other databases that put out there that has a category of salt affected fields, especially for North Carolina, or is that coming soon? What I'm thinking is to name something a salt affected field has financial implications for a farmer. So just play that out.
You just nailed it. We have to be very careful with that. Again, we're projecting limitations on someone's land, and that gets into, do I qualify for certain programs and things like that? So we tend not to do that until we have a solution. What is the solution? okay, if we're going to turn around and say, hey, half of your soybean field now is sterile as far as it goes for you to produce an ag crop, or we are working currently too. The Restore America's Estuaries conference coming up this October. You'll see there, we were down in the last time the national one was down in New Orleans, for example. We had with us a lot of folks from our plant material center, NRCS plant material centers, and they were showing the crops that we're trying to be able to replace that can take the higher salt levels, higher soil salinities. And so we're trying to make a market for that. So then you get into ag marketing, you get into, a larger group of the USDA. And so there is a ton of people working on that. So yeah, you're right. Before we go out and say, hey, this is a salt affected field, we want to have things in place that we're not just out and saying, hey, sorry, you got a salt affected field and there's nothing you can do about it. In other words, we want to have programmatic dollars behind it, and we want to have plants. So we're working on several different aspects of it before we drop that to the public, let's just say.
That totally makes sense. You don't want to just say, you get a toothache. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're a little past the hour, but I want to again thank Greg for his presentation. Really appreciate it. Very informative. And I guess we'll conclude, and I want to wish you all great rest of the day. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.